My name's Ann Buell. I'm the class of '88, and I'm the chair of the Pembroke Center's Advisory Council, a group of alumni and friends who support the Pembroke Center's work. And we're thrilled to have all of you here live in particular. We have not met live for a couple of years, so this is a very exciting event for all of us. It's great to see students, families, alumni, faculty, and friends of the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women's Annual Student Prize and Grant Presentations, which is always one of the most fun things that we do, so we really can't wait to hear what the students have put together. This year marks the 40th anniversary of the Pembroke Center, which was founded a decade after Pembroke College was founded. It was the Women's College of Brown and then merged fully with the Men's College. So in addition, the Greater Brown community is celebrating 130 years of women at Brown. And so the Pembroke Center is particularly thrilled to be providing groundbreaking research on women and forms of difference and its teaching and community building missions. And we have some wonderful new folks, including Wendy, who are going to speak in a minute. So we really do renowned interdisciplinary and research programs that foster scholarship on gender difference. We're home to the Brown's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. We support students and scholars, such as we're doing today with this great group who we're honored to have with us, with fellowships, grants, and prizes. And then the center also, and I saw Mary Murphy a moment ago, but the center also has an incredible archive which preserves and celebrates the history of Brown alumni, LGBTQ history, and feminist theory, and we host a wide array of academic events as well as programs for alumni, and there's a great exhibit on the first floor for anyone who would like to stop downstairs and take a look. So on behalf of the Pembroke Center and the Advisory Council, first of all, we want to say congratulations to all of you who are graduating this weekend. Congratulations. And we're super excited to see what you all choose to do next. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy, who is the Associate Director of the Pembroke Center, and she's also the Director of the Undergraduate Program in Gender and Sexuality Studies. So Wendy, thank you, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Anne. So welcome to the members of the Pembroke Center Advisory Council, and welcome to the students who were awarded 2021 to 22 Pembroke Center prizes and research grants, and welcome to friends, family, and faculty advisors and mentors of our students. I'd also like to note that this event is being live streamed, and welcome everyone who is joining us remotely. So today we celebrate the accomplishments of 6 students who completed honors theses in the 2021 to 2022 academic year. Their concentrations include American Studies, Africana Studies, English, International Relations, and of course, Gender and Sexuality Studies. But across these various concentrations, all of their research projects focus on topics that are fundamentally about women, gender, and/or sexuality. And I'd like to direct you to the listing of undergraduate prizes and grant recipient lists, the list of these recipients on the pieces of paper at your tables. And for council members who are joining us remotely, you can see a full listing of our undergraduate and graduate prizes and grant awards in your meeting packets. And I would like to note one small correction in the meeting packet listing. The correct title for the Steinhaus-Zizin Award is the Steinhaus-Zizin Pembroke Center Research Grants for undergraduate and graduate students. And thank you, Nancy Elbuck, for catching that error. Unfortunately, one of our 6 honorees, Jamila Beesley, could not attend. She sends her regrets. And before I turn to our student presenters who are here today, I will say a few words about Jamila and her research. And so the title of her thesis is on the slide being projected above me. Jamila Beesley is a double concentrator in American Studies and International and Public Affairs. She is the 2022 recipient of both the Ruth Simmons Prize in Gender and Women's Studies and the Linda Pei Undergraduate Research Grant. The Ruth Simmons Prize in Gender and Women's Studies was inaugurated in 2008 and is awarded annually for an outstanding honors thesis on questions having to do with women or gender. Jamila received the Simmons Prize for her thesis, The Architects of the Solutions They Need, Dalit Feminism in the U.S. Caste Abolition Movement. Elena Shee, Manning Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies, advised her thesis, and Elena is over there. And I'd also like to note that Professor Shee delivered the Pembroke Center's 2022 Sherman Lecture in Gender and Sexuality Studies, and she has advised 3 of our students this year. So, Jamila's thesis traces dynamic histories of caste supremacy in the South Asian American diaspora and celebrates the growth of Dalit feminist-led organizing against Brahmanical patriarchy. Using a variety of primary media sources, Jamila narrates seemingly disparate stories of immigration, labor exploitation, sensationalized journalism, vigilante rescue, white feminism, and powerful South Asian feminist resistance to contextualize the nascent Dalit civil rights movement in the United States. Her thesis uplifts the vibrant work of Dalit feminist activists and young anti-caste organizers advocating for protections against caste discrimination in civil rights policies. It was a privilege to read her thesis and to experience her scholarship. So our 5 grant and award recipients who are here will present in alphabetical order, and I will introduce each student and the title of their project before they present. After each student presents, there will be time for 1 to 2 questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and someone will bring a mic to you so that everyone in the room can hear you, as well as those who are watching via the live stream. So, first up, we have Sabrina Bajwa, who completed her degree in Gender and Sexuality Studies last semester. She is thus our 21.5er, and she is the recipient of the Joan Wallach Scott Prize. The Scott Prize is for an outstanding honors thesis on gender and sexuality. Scott is the Harold F. Linder Professor of Social Science and the Institute for Advanced Study, and was the founding director of the Pembroke Center. Sabrina's project was titled Fortifying the Boundaries of Citizenship Through the Simultaneous Rhetoric of Anti-Birth and Anti-Abortion, Reproductive Injustice as a Tool of Immigration Enforcement. And I want to welcome Sabrina up to the podium.
Hi, everyone. As Professor Lee said, my name is Sabrina, and I'll be giving a brief presentation of the work that I did through my thesis. So I'd first like to start off by thanking my advisors, Professor Shi, as well as Dr. Williams, who provided me with instrumental guidance throughout this whole process. And I'd also like to thank the Pembroke Center Advisory Council for their support for my work. So I'd like to start off with a bit of background of what drove me to this thesis topic. I am from Texas, and I grew up in Texas, and so as a child growing up in the South, I witnessed a lot of cuts to reproductive care, not just abortion access, but other forms of health care, as well as increasing anti-immigrant rhetoric and militarization of our border with Mexico. As a young woman and as a woman of color, I always had identified as pro-choice, but I also found a little bit of discomfort within that label because to me it felt like a lot more was at stake than just abortion rights. So one of the main questions that I had been asking sort of since I was younger, and then when I eventually had the language to actually formulate this question, was how does being pro-choice challenge the fundamental structures of oppression that are embedded within this nation? And so that is the question that sat at the heart of this thesis and that inspired a lot of my work. And so these structures of oppression often produce contradictory logics. And so I was very interested, being from Texas, in both immigration as well as reproductive justice. And so I analyzed 2 case studies. The first one is that in December of 2020, a whistleblower named Dawn Wooten came forward, and she gave light to allegations of forced hysterectomies as well as gynecological abuse that had occurred at a detention center in Georgia. And the second case is that just 2 years prior to that, the Trump administration had been denying pregnant minors the right to an abortion, and even doing things so far as to physically prevent them from leaving those detention centers, although they are legally entitled to an abortion as per Roe. And so I looked at these 2 cases, first because at the outset, they have a contradiction. On the one hand, you have folks arguing for anti-birth approaches, so forced sterilization. And on the other hand, you have the government also saying that immigrant minors can't have abortions, so anti-abortion rhetoric. And so I wanted to make sense of this. How do we understand this, in which a fear of anchor babies coexists at the same time with the government denying pregnant minors the right to an abortion? And so I analyzed legal documents, as a lot of these, this information was only available through court cases and through a lot of the court reporters, as well as news sources, to see how it was portrayed in popular media. And so this contradiction can only be understood through reproductive justice. So reproductive justice is a framework that was innovated by Black women in the early 1990s, and it provides a more fulsome context for how we can understand how structures of oppression constrain people's choices and their rights. So reproductive justice primarily focuses on the right to have a child, the right to not have a child, and most importantly, the right to be able to raise children in healthy communities. So I argue that both forced sterilization as well as forced birth exist as forms and weapons of immigration enforcement in order to further white supremacy. They fit very neatly within the historical narrative of migrant women and also women of color being used as proxies for illegality, immorality, and representations of threats to the nation. So instead of, while we also have borders defined with militarization and with walls, this is another way of defining the border and who gets to be a legitimate citizen and who doesn't get to be a citizen. And so I want to briefly end with a question that I considered a lot throughout this thesis process, as well as something that I considered in my conclusion, which is, where do we go from here? As many of you know, there's been an extreme backsliding of abortion rights in many states, with the Supreme Court most likely about to overturn Roe. And something that caught my attention within that leaked Supreme Court draft was the phrase that the US is lacking the domestic supply of infants. That very much connects to a lot of my research and what I've shown, and how a lot of anti-abortion approaches are based on a fear that other races are going to take over the white majority and that there needs to be more white babies. But one of the things that I analyzed towards the end of my thesis is the necessity of grassroots movements and structures based on community care. A lot of this is informed in my work with the Texas Equal Access Fund, which is an abortion fund in the Dallas area in Texas. And so these folks are committed to providing not just access to abortion, but also they're committed to making that right a reality for many people, for which that right, though Roe has been legal since the 1970s, for many people that right has been out of reach. And so I argue and I conclude that reproductive justice needs to be affirmed, not just as a subset of the pro-choice movement or as in a more inclusive movement, but rather as a complete alternate paradigm in order to imagine a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. Would anyone like to ask Sabrina a question? Oh, Diane will bring you a microphone.
So actually in September, I'll be going to Spain to teach English through Fulbright, so I'm very excited for that. But in the long term, I'm thinking about going into academia to be a professor, probably in the gender studies area. And I'd love to continue to be doing reproductive justice work, and since I'm from Texas, that obviously sits very close to my heart.
Thank you everyone for pretending that we don't hear that car alarm.
Very distracting.
That was just, I was fortunate to hear an earlier, longer presentation of your work, and I was really interested at the time of your focus on the grassroots organizations, and you had a very cogent critique of some of the, what you were supporting Planned Parenthood and the larger national organizations, but you had a very cogent critique as well, and I'm wondering if in light of the prospect of losing Roe, how you're feeling about both legislative and judicial efforts to try to secure abortion rights.
Yeah, I think that the legislative and judicial efforts are still extremely important because obviously if Roe is overturned and abortion were to become illegal, which in many states it would be illegal, then it doesn't matter if there's tons of money to be able to fundraise for people to get abortions if it's illegal. But at the same time, I think one thing that I highlight in my thesis is the really large discrepancy between the amount of money that a lot of these grassroots organizations and abortion funds receive versus organizations like Planned Parenthood and NARAL. And the discrepancy is just very big because a lot of the money that some of the larger organizations receive often ends up going towards either lobbying or ends up going towards elections. And that there's a lot of their money that is unaccounted for as well. And so I think that that tends to be a larger problem, especially in the context of when these smaller organizations are so underfunded. And then the other issue is that whenever there is something happening in the news regarding reproductive rights or regarding abortion access, there's sort of this boom and bust model where there's an influx of funding to many abortion funds, which is great, but then it is unsustainable because as soon as the focus shifts, they lose all of that money. And so it's very hard when you have the money keep going like up and down. And so it needs to be more sustained. But yeah, I just don't think there should be such a huge discrepancy between the organizations that are actually trying to make those rights a reality, but then organizations that are fighting on more the legal side. They're both important, but there shouldn't be such a big discrepancy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Okay, next we will hear from Emma Blake, who is a concentrator in international relations. She was awarded the Helen Terry Mcleod Research Grant, which is for students from any field in support of completion of an honors thesis on issues related to women and gender. The title of her thesis is Gender-Based Violence and State-Sponsored Aggression, an analysis of the relationship between intimate partner violence and state militarization.
I'm going to move this up a little. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emma Blake, and I would like to start off by thanking my advisors, Professor Rose McDermott and Professor Wendy Schiller, who are both in the political science departments, and of course the Pembroke Center Advisory Council for supporting this research. My thesis explores the relationship between gender-based violence and state-sponsored aggression, specifically by looking at the relationship between intimate partner violence, which from now on I'll refer to as IPV, and state militarization. While most IR literature completely ignores gendered explanations of militarization, there is an increasing body of literature that recognizes that gender is indeed an important factor in explaining state outcomes. With this literature in mind, I've started wondering about the relationship between violence against women and state behavior. And when I say state behavior, I'm referring to the decisions made and actions taken at the state level. More specifically, this wondering led me to ask, what is the relationship between rates of intimate partner homicide and state militarization in member states of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD? I study rates of intimate partner homicide as a proxy for intimate partner violence, and I study state militarization in the form of military expenditures as a proxy for state behavior. I chose to study intimate partner homicides because it is a direct, tangible form of violence against women that has previously not been used as an independent variable in any studies that look at the relationship between the treatment of women and the behavior of a state. And I chose militarization because I consider militarization to be a type of state behavior that relies on force, aggression, and violence. And so ultimately, using these variables allows me to examine the relationship between violence against women in the home on one hand and violence at the state level on the other. So I hypothesized that IPV, and specifically intimate partner homicides, would serve as a positive and statistically significant predictor of state military expenditures. I argue that this cycle starts with intimate partner violence. When children experience violence in the context of their home and family, they learn that conflict resolution requires violence and aggression. Such behaviors can then become commonplace or more commonplace in general societal interactions as the people who grew up in these homes begin to kind of accept and embody the types of conflict resolution methods that they learn in their home in broader culture and society. These behaviors then have the power to guide state decisions because these decisions are made by the political leaders and other individuals who comprise a state who similarly grew up in these cultures and who typically tend to reflect and embody these kinds of cultures as well. While I posit that this relationship begins in the home, I also argue that it's cyclical. So increased militarization reinforces attitudes of violence generally, specifically attitudes of violence towards women, and then the cycle loops all over again. In terms of my research design, I chose to study OECD countries because they tend to represent the best case scenario for women. So women typically have higher levels of education, a greater degree of financial independence, and generally more social and political rights in these countries. So finding a positive and statistically significant relationship here would mean that the relationship is likely to exist to a more intense extent elsewhere. I also chose to study 2010 to 2020 to update existing literature, the most recent of which that is similar to this study was undertaken in 2008. In terms of my methods, I took a quantitative approach and I used a linear regression analysis because I wanted to examine a lot of data from a lot of different countries over this 10-year period. And I also wanted to mitigate the possibility of omitted variables bias by controlling for other variables that potentially influence this relationship. For my variables, I use the rate of female gun deaths per 100,000 people to operationalize intimate partner homicides. And I know this isn't a perfect measure because not all female gun deaths are intimate partner homicides, but this potential slight overcount is counteracted by the fact that, one, not all intimate partner homicides are committed by gun, and two, the vast majority of cases of IPV do not actually culminate in death or homicide. So by any count, my findings, according to this logic, actually underestimate the true extent of the predictive power of IPV as like a broader representation, with intimate partner homicides being the more specifically operationalized variable. For my dependent variable, I operationalized militarization by using defense spending as a percentage of GDP, kind of with the idea that a state has to direct money towards something if it really cares about it. And there's a lot more on that I'm happy to chat about later if that would be helpful. For my control variables, I used various government spending indicators, gender equality indicators, and state security indicators to control for the influence of other factors on defense spending. And once again, I actually do have my giant taxonomy of models at the end of this slide if we need to go back to it, but hopefully we don't have to, it's a lot of numbers. For my findings, so I actually found my hypothesis to hold. In each of the 4 models of 25 that I constructed, I ended on 4. An increase in the rate of female gun deaths served as a positive and statistically significant predictor of defense spending as a percentage of GDP. In fact, for every 1 unit increase in female gun deaths per 100,000 people, defense spending as a percentage of GDP increased by between 1.4 and 2.0 percentage points, controlling for these various government spending, gender equality, and state security indicators. This study has important theoretical and practical implications. As the first study to examine IPV and militarization in tandem, this study strengthens existing literature that finds that indicators of the treatment of women do in fact have strong and powerful predictive power over state behavior and outcomes. And practically, this thesis shows that reducing violent methods of conflict resolution requires more comprehensive approaches to understanding and tackling gender-based violence in the home in OECD countries. Such an approach should tackle gender-based violence from both bottom-up and top-down approaches. So if anything, my findings show that actions and behaviors at the individual level do actually have powerful predictive power over actions and behaviors at the state level. So combining these legally top-down oriented solutions and these bottom-up culturally oriented solutions is key. Thank you very much.
Would anyone like to ask Emma a question?
Hi, thank you so much for sharing. I wanted to ask a question. I know you said that that your method was mostly quantitative, but I'm wondering if in your research you came across any qualitative sources, whether that be memoirs or interviews or video clips on the news or something of people talking about their experiences depending on either side that they land on, and just how if that's something that you thought about or that you came across, and how that sort of factored into your research that I know was mostly quantitative.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So initially when I embarked on this project, I planned on doing a mixed methods approach. So I wanted to complement this kind of quantitative approach with interviews with domestic violence activists. That was kind of the idea. Unfortunately, certain time, energy, IRB restrictions made that not possible. But it's something that I'm hoping to pursue further at the graduate level. But I think there's a lot of really interesting kind of feminist literature in international relations that draws not only on statistics, but on some of these more qualitative approaches in kind of coming up with these arguments. And there's a lot of really old philosophical texts that I looked at. For example, Sylviane Agacinski is a French feminist philosopher who I rooted some of this kind of theorizing in. So while I did not have the opportunity to look as in-depth at some of those qualitative sources, as you're mentioning, I think some of the stuff that I did use incorporated that. But again, I'm really hoping to continue this project and dive more deeply into the qualitative side as I move forward.
Could you talk a little bit about cause and effect?
Yeah.
Circle.
Back to this slide. Yeah, so it's funny because I had one advisor, Professor McDermott, who agreed with me on the causal kind of relationship that I'm positing here, and then I had Professor Wendy Schiller completely disagree with me and be like, no, it starts with these broader kind of militarized societies and then kind of trickles down. And so I think it's something that, unfortunately, a linear regression analysis cannot fully prove. There's no such way to do that. But I think the way that I theorize this is when you have, a state doesn't just do things without, a state as an entity is not a person that has the power to make decisions. Men in homes who beat their wives do have the consciousness to be able to kind of do that. And so that's kind of where this is rooted. In the idea that it's actually individuals who have the power to kind of shape these broader outcomes, and individuals, when they comprise this sort of collective society, then have the power to kind of shape the culture of a state. Again, I know it's not perfect. I know there's no way to ever fully prove it. That's the approach that I decided to take. And I actually did run the regression opposite as well to see what the influence would be of state militarization on female gun deaths. There was a positive and statistically significant relationship, but it wasn't as powerful, predictive power-wise. That's something that I got into in the actual thesis itself, but didn't have the time to talk about today. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Emma. Okay. Next, we will hear from Lillian Pickett, who is a concentrator in American Studies. She received an honorable mention for the Ruth Simmons Prize in Gender and Women's Studies. The title of her senior thesis is Engendering Violence, Imagining Safety, Carceral Politics in Rhode Island's Feminist Movement, 1970 to 2009.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lily, and I will be presenting on my thesis, Engendering Violence, Imagining Safety, Carceral Politics, and Rhode Island's Feminist Movement, 1970 to 2009. Before I begin, I want to thank my advisors, Professor Lena Shee and Professor Helen Sick, for your support throughout this project, and of course also the Pembroke Center Advisory Council for bringing us together today to present our work and for supporting my work as well. When I began thinking about writing this thesis, I had recently encountered Emily Thuma's book, All Our Trials, which describes efforts both within and outside of U.S. prisons to forge a radical feminist politic against incarceration as gender violence throughout the 1970s and 80s. And at the same time that I was reading about the making of an anti-carceral feminist movement at the end of the 20th century, I was involved in a local campaign organized by the sex worker rights group Coyote Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Formerly Incarcerated Union, and the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls to shut down the women's prison in Rhode Island, and pending that victory, to grant clemency to women who had been incarcerated for over a decade in Rhode Island prisons. Like the organizers in Emily Thuma's history, the women spearheading this campaign are determined to protect marginalized women from further racist and classist state violence. Their vision of a safe feminist future is one without a carceral system that deepens poverty and violence in the lives of incarcerated women and their communities. And so in the midst of all this, I found myself interested in tracing local legacies of anti-carceral or abolitionist feminist organizing in Rhode Island. But when I began to explore the archives here at Brown, with the support of Mary Murphy, the Pembroke Center archivist, I actually went down a very different path. Over the summer of 2021, I explored the John Hay Library's collections related to Rhode Island feminist organizing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, all of which had been collected by the Pembroke Center. And what I found in the library was that many of these collections had been donated by university-adjacent women and many white middle-class feminist activists who had been involved in the second wave feminist movement and the broader anti-violence movement. And these collections represented an entirely different feminist politic than the one that Thuma traces in all our trials or that the organizers I've been working with focus on. Rather than contextualizing the carceral state as a vector of gender-based violence, the white middle-class feminist organizers that I encountered in the archive tended toward what sociologist Elizabeth Bernstein calls carceral feminism. That is, the belief that law enforcement, the court, and prison system are essential allies in the feminist fight against violence, as opposed to perpetrators of gendered violence in themselves. And so my thesis traces how and why the mainstream white feminist movement in Rhode Island embraced carceral politics at the end of the 20th century. And I approached this question in several ways throughout the thesis, but one of the essential threads of my argument that I want to discuss with the time I have left is based on feminist theorist Nancy Fraser's argument that feminist values were made to betray the radical hopes of the early second wave movement as organizers became gradually unmoored from more capacious visions of gender justice. So as mainstream white feminist organizers in Rhode Island abandoned calls for economic justice in favor of cultural battles, I argue relationships with carceral institutions became more attractive. And we can see this transition in records related to Take Back the Night organizing in Rhode Island. As some context, Take Back the Night marches were women-only processions staged at night, often through city streets, and these marches worked to temporarily construct safe environments for women who might typically experience the public as unnavigable. Of course, these marches necessarily defined what safety meant, depending on the social identities of the organizers themselves, and so often in contradictory ways. In the early 1970s, Rhode Island feminist organizers marched through the streets of Providence in an effort to assert themselves as public actors and to demand economic and social justice in actions like National Women's Strike Day. Access to the city, symbolically staged in these early protests, meant access to work, transportation, politics, and justice in more material terms. Throughout the 1980s, however, the Rhode Island Take Back the Night movement adopted a much narrower call for justice, that is, freedom from sexual violence and assault alone. As a result, Take Back the Night demands were increasingly tied to campaigns for crime-based recognition in the law. In 2000, at one of the last Take Back the Night marches in Rhode Island, longtime organizer Jody Glass described what crime-based recognition might look like, asking protesters to imagine if every police officer truly integrated a feminist mindset into every day, imagine if lawmakers took enforcement of the law seriously and used it consistently, imagine a world without the current epidemic of violence against women, imagine a totally celebratory Take Back the Night. With these words, Jody Glass, a white middle-class woman unlikely to be arrested or incarcerated, suggested that a truly safe feminist world would be one in which the criminal legal system adopted a feminist conscience and took violence against women seriously. To Glass and activists like her in Rhode Island, feminism's most fruitful strategy would be translating its ideals into the language of the law, that is, promoting an understanding of violence against women as a crime to be prosecuted and punished. And just briefly, I want to explain why this feminist carceralism matters and what its consequences have been. As white feminist Take Back the Night activists marched through the streets of downtown Providence, campaigning to stop rape in the 1980s and 1990s, their efforts intersected with concurrent law and order campaigns that expanded the surveillance and arrest of criminalized people, including Black men and men of color deemed dangerous, and also sexually profiled women simply occupying public space. Between 1979 and 2000, the prime years of the Rhode Island Take Back the Night movement, the rate of women's incarceration in Rhode Island increased from 17 women to 212 incarcerated women. And in the early 2000s, while Glass called for more attention to prostitution as a gender-based hate crime, more women were imprisoned in Rhode Island for prostitution-related charges than for any other offense. Understanding this recent history, I believe, is essential to imagining truly safe publics, and to lend support to the transformative anti-carceral and abolitionist feminist activism currently taking place in Rhode Island. I'm hopeful that this research demonstrates the essential task of investigating difficult feminist histories as a means of reorienting ourselves to the present feminist cause. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lily. Questions for Lily?
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I guess I had a two-part question. The first was, what sparked the genesis of your research? Sort of where did the idea come from? And the second piece of it is, what was the most surprising element that you learned throughout the, work that you did, the research, the thesis, and everything else?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So I guess originally, as I mentioned, I had been working with Coyote, Rhode Island, which is a sex worker rights organization here, and had been thinking a lot about the kinds of complications of advocating for attention to sexual violence and gender-based violence at the same time that the criminal legal system was a target of feminist activism in this way, in the way that I had been describing. And so as I said, I originally was interested in thinking about abolitionist feminism and the legacies in Rhode Island, which there are many, and also connecting to some of the transformative abolitionist organizing that was happening in Boston in this period as well, with the Combahee River Collective and their Take Back the Night efforts. And so I was interested in kind of tracing white feminist histories in Rhode Island in the context of all of this as I was sort of involved in the organizing here. And then the most surprising thing that I encountered, I guess I was really lucky to actually get to meet some of the organizers whose papers I was encountering. So Jody Glass, for example, who I mentioned, generously talked to me several times about her experience. And I suppose one of the things that came out of those conversations for me was how willing to reflect and admit some of the wrongdoings of her movement. She was really helpful in that way, and also I think I was surprised to learn that she had no awareness of some of these other abolitionist movements for many reasons, because she was white, because she was in a very insulated university-based white feminist group here in Rhode Island, and so those conversations were very, very interesting and illuminating for me throughout the process, and I talk more about that in the thesis as well.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about the present moment, because I think your thesis is fabulous in unearthing this history of white feminism. Where are we now in abolitionist politics? And what is the role now of attention to violent crime in that movement? And it's very complicated. And how does the present moment think about the imperative for anti-rape action and recognition, and yet this move to abolish or radically transform the carceral state we have now?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. So I think something that comes to mind is the part of abolitionist feminist thinking that is not just destroy the current carceral system, but build up alternatives that actually provide care and safety to people. And so I think one of the misconceptions sometimes with abolition and abolitionist feminism as well is that there is, the alternative is perhaps not there. It's a movement focused on destroying what currently exists, when that is entirely not the case. In fact, I think abolition has one of the best prescriptions for how to move forward with actually protecting women from gender-based violence and sexual violence. As we know, sending people who are already experiencing violent actions or the urge to create violence to violent places where they are locked away for years and years does not help to alleviate the kind of pressure on our culture and society that causes that violence in the first place. And so in my view, I think listening to organizers like those who are working here in Rhode Island, the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, their pressing argument for the closure of the Rhode Island Women's Prison and the institution of other means of care and redress, and also focusing on the material and economic needs of women in the state that aren't being addressed in the current moment. So I think listening to those organizers is really the path forward. But it is a complicated question, and I appreciate you asking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. Next, we have Sydney Smith, who is a double concentrator in Africana Studies and Political Science. She's the recipient of the Barbara Anton Internship Grant, which is awarded for students planning to do a senior honors thesis involving an internship or volunteer work in a community agency, and whose work is related to the welfare of women or children. The title of her senior thesis is I Am a Revolutionary Black Woman, Black Power Visions in the Narratives of Women in the Black Panther Party.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sydney, and today I'm going to share a little bit about my thesis entitled I Am a Revolutionary Black Woman, Black Power Visions in the Narratives of Women in the Black Panther Party. Before I get started, I want to extend a note of gratitude to the Department of Africana Studies, my advisor, Professor Francois Hamlin, my second reader, Professor Aliyah Abdur-Rahman, as well as the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship and the Pembroke Advisory Council, whose support was absolutely crucial to this project. So my first introduction to the Black Panther Party was a lesson on the 10-point platform developed by the organization's co-founders, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. In their demands for land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace, it was clear that the Panthers were committed to the survival and self-determination of Black people everywhere. Yet, I noticed an absence of women's issues listed in the 10-point platform. While education, housing, incarceration, and employment affected Black communities, everywhere, the 10-point platform failed to mention issues of reproductive justice, sexual violence, gender inequality, or any other issues faced by Black women in particular. Even the language throughout the statement obscured Black women. It argued that a guaranteed income should be given to every Black man, and that Black men should be released from jails and prisons around the country. But where were the unemployed and incarcerated Black women? Who spoke for them, who had struggled alongside Black men for decades? Or did they speak for themselves? So the scholarship of the Intersectional Black Panther Party History Project, composed of Tracy Matthews, Mary Phillips, Angela LeBlanc Ernest, and Robin Spencer, has unearthed the centrality of women to the organization. Through their research, Black women have emerged as some of the most efficient and skilled organizers within the party. While the visible leadership of the party consisted of mostly men, Panther women ran the organization, which is a common occurrence in so many movement organizations. Women spearheaded the party's international newspaper, served free breakfast to Black children, staffed health clinics throughout Black neighborhoods, created robust and Black-centered educational programs, organized political campaigns to free incarcerated members, and designed collective child care facilities for Panther children. So while women's centrality to the organization's daily function is well documented, the intellectual and theoretical contributions of Panther women to the Black Power movement and Black freedom struggle more broadly was less clear. Men like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and Eldridge Cleaver are overwhelmingly credited with the Panthers' vision of revolution. But if Black women participated and led the organization, it is likely that they were thinkers and theorists too. Interested in how Panther women understood themselves and their roles in the struggle, my project turns to their personal narratives, autobiographies, essays, interview, poetry, and artwork to examine how they theorized new ideas about Black power through their roles as women, mothers, and radical revolutionaries. So in Chapter 1, I trace a brief history of the development of the Black Panther Party with a particular focus on the centrality of women in every aspect of the organization. In highlighting women's leadership, both formal and informal, I established their significant participation in the party's platform before turning to the ways that they thought about Black power and liberation. Chapter 2 focuses on the experiences and activism of Elaine Brown, who was one of the most central figures in the organization and the only woman to lead the party from 1974 to 1977. And so I close read moments from Brown's autobiography called A Taste of Power, A Black Woman's Story, in which I examine the importance of Panther women's relationship with one another as a site of resistance to the party's sexism, and consider how Comrade Sisters collectively developed a Black feminist consciousness within the ranks of a hyper-masculine organization. In Chapter 3, I center my analysis around the autobiography of Assata Shakur, who was a member of the Panthers' underground offshoot, the Black Liberation Army, and who is currently exiled in Cuba for her Black Power activism. And so Shakur's analysis demonstrates that women's relationships with one another were critical spaces in which they developed their political consciousness and creative ways of thinking about freedom that departed from those espoused by their male comrades. And in both Brown and Shakur's accounts, motherhood was a dynamic institution for Panther women. For some, it strengthened their commitment to the struggle and informed their capacious ideas of freedom, but for others, being a mother signaled the ways that they really negotiated the racial and gendered order of the time and sought more formal avenues of leadership. So to conclude, I kind of wanted to reflect on some of the main takeaways from my research, and that is a single history of the Black Panther Party doesn't exist and cannot exist. It's impossible to tell a single story of the women who ran the organization as well. Panther women contributed to the party in a myriad of ways, and in doing so, carved out space for themselves within an organization that prioritized male dominance. Their struggle against the sexist attitudes and behaviors of their male comrades did not compromise their commitment to the Black liberation struggle, but actually strengthened it. Drafting articles and statements, developing networks of support, promoting each other to leadership roles, confronting male comrades, and authoring personal narratives, Panther women developed a Black feminist position that understood sexism as integral to the systems of racism, capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism that the party sought to dismantle. Framing their resistance against gender inequality and experiences of motherhood within the rubric of Black power, women in the party theorized radical new ideas about Black liberation. The multiplicity in Panther women's stories offers an important lesson for tracing the history of the Black Panther Party. These two stories of Brown and Shakur show that the history of the party cannot be singular. To squeeze the contradictions and tensions within the party into a single narrative fails to capture the robust ways that Panther women and men dedicated their lives to liberating Black people everywhere. Previous accounts of the organization's trajectory treat the Black Panther Party as either categorically sexist or the complete embodiment of equality, but the truth exists somewhere on the spectrum. Yet it's impossible to actually capture the legacy of the Black Panther Party without a critical analysis of the debates, inconsistencies, and stories of the people who pushed the movement forward despite their lack of public recognition. And so I hope that this thesis represents just like one teeny step towards recovering a more expansive history of the Black Panther Party, and also of the Black women who traversed oppressive expectations of how they ought to be and envision more capacious ideas of freedom from within. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney. We have a question over here.
Hi, that was fascinating, and I'm
Thank
kind
you.
of shocked that I don't know the names of these women. It sounds like an amazing opportunity for a book. But I'm curious about if you have plans for it, for going further with this material. And also, I'm wondering what happened to those women. I know you said that Shakur went to Cuba, but I'm interested to hear.
Sorry, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Right, what happened to those women leaders?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I guess for the first question, what I plan to do with it, I plan on applying to graduate programs in African American studies, but I'm going to take a little bit of gap year first because I'm a bit tired. But I would really love to continue this project. And in fact, there were so many ways that I wish that I could expand. At the beginning of the thesis process, I was like, I don't know how I'll ever write so much. And at the end of it, I was like, there's so much more that I want to include. And so I think it's opening up to include more of the women, because many of them have taken matters into their own hands and have written their own histories, regardless of whether that is included in larger, more public anthologies of the Black Panther Party. And so I would love to analyze those, and also artwork too, that they're sort of life writing and remembering themselves and bearing witness to the cohort of themselves has taken different forms. So it's memoirs and autobiographies, but they've also written a lot of poetry, especially while a lot of them were incarcerated because of the state surveillance of the federal government against the Black Panther Party and other Black political movements, that they wrote a lot of poetry that described these large ideas of Black liberation that was about race and gender, and also crafted a lot of artwork that was published in the newspaper. So there's so many more stories, so many more narratives that I really hope to bring in and analyze in the future. And then for the second part of your question about the women, which is another part I wish I had expanded upon in my actual thesis, is that their activism did not stop when the Black Panther Party started fading away in the late 70s, early 80s because of this really intense backlash from the federal government, that they continued. Elaine Brown today, who I believe is in her late 80s, but still kicking, and she's touring the country, and she offers lessons on the Black Panther Party, particularly about the centrality of women and how they absolutely ran every aspect of the organization, though they're not credited for it. So she continues to sort of do this teaching and mentorship work. Assata Shakur, even while in exile in Cuba, she mentors Black Afro-Cuban political activists using the sort of knowledge that she developed while working in the party, in the underground offshoot So she continues to mentor new generations of Black activists, Black women activists abroad and all over the country as well. And all of them continue to do a work. Another woman, Erica Huggins, who is absolutely central to the party, continues to do speaker series tours and has built new school systems in Oakland, California, where she still lives, who has traveled to prisons to talk about the legacy of the Black Panther Party, offer materials and build relationships, that they are still working and that they're still dreaming and envisioning of how to liberate Black people everywhere. So they're continuing to do this work, and I think it's really cool. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. I really appreciate the nuance that you're bringing to this. And also, just as a parent, I want to thank all the presenters for just incredible clarity in terms of how you're summarizing such important, complex work so well for us in 10 minutes. But I'm interested in whether or not you found any lessons from people like Angela Davis and others who actually were able to find a place as women and also as very visible leaders to the world in this, and how that was navigated within the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the autobiographies that I had planned to include was her autobiography, which I believe she just published a second edition of. So that's on my list to get. And I think what's really interesting about Angela Davis, and also why I didn't want to include her in this iteration of my project, is that I think that her autobiography is an autobiography and it's about her, but I think she more clearly and more directly weaves in a sort of structural analysis of how race and power and capitalism sort of like operate in the United States, but also globally too. That it's an autobiography, but it's also deeply like political. Like it also reads as an essay, and that I think could be like a lesson plan for a lot of people, while also narrating her own life story. And so I think for her, for the scope of this project, to narrow it, I wanted to focus on women who in their memoirs or who in their narratives linked that sort of theorizing specifically with their roles as women and mothers. But I think what I learned from women like Angela Davis and even women like Elaine Brown was that the way that they understood themselves varied so differently, though they all were in the Black Panther Party and though they all were sort of formed like a clique together to resist the sort of sexist attitudes and behaviors of their male comrades, that they all sort of thought about gender equality or what that would mean and what that would look like completely differently. And so I think for Angela Davis and also similarly for Elaine Brown, that there's like a real struggling with these expectations of motherhood or just to be a woman, even in this sort of Black feminist position that they're trying to work through, that there's a real struggle about, well, like, what does that really mean, and do I really want it? Whereas for Assata Shakur, being a mother and being a radical freedom fighter who was in favor of armed self-defense, for her, those two things went right together, and there was no gap, there was no space in between them, that they were incredibly similar. So I think what I gained from all of these different stories was that they were all really different in the way that they thought of themselves as women, as mothers, as activists, and that it's kind of impossible to flatten it and to say all Black Panther women thought about themselves in this way, but that there's incredibly rich divergence in all of their stories and in all of their theorizing that I think it's really fruitful to sit in that discomfort of inconsistency. So I think I could say more, but I could say more about a lot of things.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Sydney. And last but not least, Lily Willis, who will be completing her degree in Gender and Sexuality Studies and English this fall, is the recipient of the Enid Wilson Undergraduate Travel Fellowship, which supports travel expenses for innovative research by undergraduate students from any department pursuing work related to women and gender. The title of her thesis is Expressing the Inexpressible and Other Queer Sentiments, Language and Self in Contemporary Queer Memoir. Excuse me.
Hi, everybody. In the spirit of subjectivity and messiness, this is going to be a little bit messy. I hand wrote these and then scanned them. I thank you so much for all being here today, and to the Pembroke Center Advisory Board for bringing us all together and helping fund this. And thank you to my advisors, Jacques Khalippe and Helen, who's here. So my project is called Expressing the Inexpressible, and it's about language and the self in contemporary queer memoir. And it began actually born out of Professor Elena Shee's class about anti-trafficking, and I was thinking a lot about the way that we write about gender in the media at that time, and how that was a really good way. I'm an English major too, and so I was trained in sort of close reading. And close reading the news, and how the way we write about gender can actually tell us a lot about how we think of gender, and then it's becomes this vicious cycle, right, where we're reinforcing the way we think about things through what we read and how we write. And so I knew that my method was going to be kind of whatever. I knew I wanted to look at gender and race and class and sexuality and all these identity categories and how they work together, and I knew that I wanted to be looking at texts. And then I was okay, I don't know. Now I don't know where I'm going to go with that. And then I was also, so I was just sort of digging through. I was looking at archives. I was looking at books, whatever. And I ended up finding that in a lot of queer theory, queer texts, people were doing a lot of writing from their own personal experience to look for understanding the sort of broader social context. And so I was interested in those places where they were very explicitly kind of writing about themselves in order to learn something about our world. And so I decided that I would kind of go to queer theory and look at some queer memoirs and use that as a way to understand what we mean when we talk about queer. Because I think it was also this kind of flashy thing at the time when it was sophomore year, it was the big joke was anytime you want to come up with a class title, you'd be oh, it's going to be queering data science or queering the whatever, anything. Queering the earth sciences was I think a real one. It was and so I was okay, there's something happening here with the term queer, and then it's also kind of inherently contradictory. So that was really interesting to me. People were really, really debating whether it was, for example, an identity term, gay or lesbian or straight, and how does queer interact with that? And then also people really pushing in the other direction really hard and saying it is not an identity term. It counteracts all of those things. It pushes against the idea that we need to have sexuality be an identity category, right? And so I was trying to work through all of that, and I decided I would look at primarily two people's queer memoirs. So these are writers, and these are their memoirs, Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts and Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House. And I chose them. One, I just loved both of these books. They were the kinds of books where you're I'm going to read for 5 minutes, and then my day was over and I had done nothing but read them. And then I also think that they're doing really different things, but they're both doing a really good job of this exact thing that I was interested in, which is blending the personal and the analytical and the theoretical, and allowing their own experience to be just as good a site for research and exploration as any other way of knowing something. And then I realized that I was in for it, because the one thing that they had in common was that they both were always talking about how they didn't feel like they had the language to write about what they wanted to write about. And so I was reading that, and then I was trying to write about how they didn't have the language for what they wanted to write about. So then I was always kind of banging my head against the desk trying to figure out what to say. But it was really, then I learned a lot, right? Because I was okay, how do they, right? They're writing anyway, which I think is really beautiful and wonderful. And how do they do that? And so I think that that's sort of where I realized that one of the things that united them under this sort of queer umbrella was this ability to kind of take contradictory things and take this impasse where they really feel like they can't push through it, and they're pushing through it anyway, and what happens there, and what sort of productivity can come from that, what possibilities are there. So that's kind of where I ended as my sort of queer ethos that I learned from them. And then, I'll end with Carmen Maria Machado, taught us a lot. She borrows a folk tale from Panama to say, "My tale goes only to here. It ends, and the wind carries it to you." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. A question or two for Lily.
in an international context?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. Like, I think it'll be really, I think it'll be fascinating. I've had people tell me, "Oh, you're going to France, like, just wait till you see how they handle this stuff." And I'm like, what does that mean? So I don't know, but I am really curious. I'm curious to study, because I think a lot about language, right? And how, like, studying this kind of thing in a different language, the way that people write about it, affects how they think about it. And right now, the hot topic in French and other languages that have more gender stuff going on in the language itself is trying to kind of like take the gender binary out of that language. And so that's the hot topic right now. And my French is not good enough to know what that would even look like, but we'll find out. So I'm really excited to see that. And think about, like, I think it's, people say that that sort of like, you know how the articles are masculine or feminine in French, does affect the way people think about things as like much more binaristic even than the English language has the capacity for. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really admired your reflection on methodology. I just want to draw you out on the inexpressible. What's going on there?
Yeah, so the inexpressible was an interesting thing because it did come up a lot of times it's fascinating because it's like, it's such a contradiction, right? You're reading these people who have written an entire book, and the book is, they keep saying, well, I just can't write about this. I just can't do it. And yet you're like standing there looking at the book that they did write. And so I think there's something where they're saying it's impossible, but clearly there's possibility. And I think also there's something about, like, there's always that gap between your like personal experience and what you want to convey and then what comes out onto the paper, right? And these people are like, they are very well-established writers and poets, each of them. And so they have a mastery of their craft, and they're still falling back on that inexpressible idea. And then I think also there was something like each of them in really different ways keep coming back to contradictions all the time. So like Maggie Nelson uses Sedgwick. This book was written, born out of a speech she gave for Eve Sedgwick, and where she says that Sedgwick wanted things both ways all the time. Like she reflects on like this idea that anyway. So like it's interesting because I think that they really want they're really interested in like what happens when you can't express something and you're doing it anyway, and they're holding contradictory things juxtaposed all the time. For example, that inexpressibility and creating something anyway. So I found that to be like even just like personally really inspiring. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us, and I want to thank the Pembroke Center Advisory Council again for supporting the student work. It was particularly a pleasure for me to read all of the grant applications and to read the nominated theses. So I thank you for funding me doing work that was very pleasurable and intellectually stimulating too, selfishly. So I want to thank you all, and also remind everyone and invite you to attend tomorrow's commencement forum that the Pembroke Center is hosting. evening at 11 a.m. Our commencement forum is titled, Anne mentioned this at the beginning, but I want to give us another plug. Our commencement forum is titled Reflecting on Title IX at 50, Women Athletes and Their Lives at Brown and Beyond. The 11 a.m. panel discussion will take place at Metcalf Research Building at 190 Thayer Street in Friedman Auditorium. And our commencement forum is co-sponsored by the Pembroke Center, the Brown Women's Network, and the Brown Sports Foundation. So thank you again, and I hope to see all of you tomorrow morning as well. And I will see some of you for the Advisory Council business meeting starting promptly after this. So thank you. And to all the families and friends, you're welcome to linger and enjoy each other's company here a bit longer too. So thank you again.